The certified letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I remember the weather because my husband used to love days like that. The kind of slow Virginia rain that turned the lake silver and wrapped the shoreline in a soft gray haze. Daniel would sit on the porch for hours with a cup of coffee in one hand and a fishing magazine in the other, claiming rain made the world quieter. 3 months after his funeral, I was standing alone in that same kitchen when the envelope appeared in my mailbox. The return address belonged to Whitmore and Langley Legal Associates. My stomach tightened immediately. After 63 years of life, you develop instincts. Not dramatic instincts. Not movie instincts. Just the quiet feeling that trouble has already entered the room before anyone says a word. I placed the envelope beside the cutting board and stared at it for several seconds. The chicken soup simmering on the stove suddenly seemed far less important. Outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Inside, the house felt far too large. That happens after 40 years of marriage. The silence changes shape. It stops feeling peaceful. It starts feeling unfinished. Finally, I opened the letter. The first paragraph was enough. Petition for estate reconsideration. Property ownership dispute. Allegation of undue influence. I sat down before finishing the second page. Because I already knew who filed it. Vivian Thornton. My mother-in-law. Daniel's mother. The woman who had spent the previous 3 months turning grief into a weapon. I finished reading slowly. Every sentence confirmed the same thing. She wanted the lake house. Not because she loved it. Not because she needed it. Because she believed it belonged to her family. And according to the petition, she intended to prove that I manipulated her dying son into leaving it to me. I laughed. A short, exhausted laugh. The kind people make when reality becomes so absurd that anger feels unnecessary. The lake house sat on the northern edge of Smith Mountain Lake. Nothing fancy. Nothing worth fighting over if you measured life in dollars. Old cedar siding. A wooden dock. Green shutters faded by decades of sunlight. A stone fireplace Daniel built himself during the summer of 1994. But if you measured life in memories, it was priceless. We spent 34 summers there, raised our daughter there, watched sunsets there, buried our first golden retriever beneath an oak tree near the shoreline. And during the final year of Daniel's battle with cancer, it became the only place where he could still sleep peacefully. I could still picture him wrapped in a navy blanket on the dock, too weak to fish, too tired to talk much, but happy. For a while, happy. And now his mother wanted to drag those memories through court. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. Then I sat there staring at nothing. Not crying. Not angry. Just tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after enough disappointments. That evening, my daughter Emily stopped by after work. She carried grocery bags through the front door and immediately noticed my expression. What happened? I handed her the letter. She read it silently. Halfway through, her shoulders dropped. Oh God, that's about right. She lowered herself into a chair. Grandma actually filed this? Apparently, Emily rubbed her forehead. At 38, she already carried more stress than most people should. A recent divorce, 2 teenagers, hospital administration job, student loans she was still helping her oldest pay off. Life had not been gentle lately. You should settle. I looked up. What? She sighed. Mom, hear me out. I remained silent. Grandma Vivian has money. I know. She has lawyers. I know. She has connections. I nodded slowly. Emily looked miserable. I don't want you going through this. There it was. Fear. Not doubt. Fear. I reached for my tea. You think I'll lose? She didn't answer. Which was answer enough. Most people saw exactly what Vivian saw. Avidove. A grandmother. A retired woman living quietly by a lake. Someone easy to push. Someone easy to intimidate. Someone easy to underestimate. The funny thing about getting older in America is that people gradually stop seeing you. Cashiers stop making eye contact. Doctors interrupt your explanations. Young professionals explain things you already understand better than they do. You become invisible. Most days I didn't mind. After retirement, invisibility felt peaceful. But Vivian Thornton mistook invisibility for weakness. That was her first mistake. Her second mistake was believing she knew who I was. Emily looked at me carefully. "Mom?" "Yes? Are you scared?" I smiled slightly. Not because the question was funny, because it reminded me of something Daniel used to ask. "Not yet." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I haven't decided whether this is a problem." Emily shook her head. "You always do that." "Do what?" "Answer questions like a lawyer." The comment made me smile despite myself. If only she knew. The following Sunday, Vivian invited the entire family to dinner. That alone told me everything. Vivian never hosted gatherings unless she wanted an audience. Her waterfront home overlooked the Elizabeth River. White columns, expensive artwork, furniture nobody actually sat on comfortably. The kind of house designed to impress visitors rather than welcome them. The moment I stepped inside, I knew the performance had already started. Daniel's younger brother, Thomas, barely acknowledged me. His wife offered one of those practice smiles wealthy people use when they want credit for behaving decently. Emily sat beside me. Quiet. Nervous. Dinner began normally enough. Weather. Politics. Property values. Vacation plans. Then Vivian steered the conversation exactly where she wanted. "You must be struggling financially now." I looked up. She smiled sweetly. The smile never reached her eyes. "I'm managing. Legal matters become expensive." I sipped my water. Across the table, Thomas smirked. Dad always wanted family property to stay in the Thornton bloodline. I looked directly at him. Daniel made his wishes very clear. Vivian dabbed her lips with a napkin. "That's what your side claims." Interesting choice of words. At that point, I hadn't even hired an attorney, which meant she had already decided there were sides. Already decided there was a war. Already decided she was going to win. The realization settled over me quietly. Vivian leaned back in her chair. "You know your problem, Margaret?" I waited. "You always thought you were smarter than everyone else." Silence. Thomas stared into his wine. His wife suddenly became fascinated by her dinner plate. Nobody defended me. Not surprising. Families rarely challenge the loudest person in the room. Vivian continued. "You spent years pretending to understand things better than everyone." I remained calm. Then she delivered the sentence she clearly thought would finish me. "At the end of the day, you were just a housewife." The room went completely silent. Oddly enough, that hurt more than the lawsuit. Not because she insulted me, because Daniel wasn't there to hear it. Daniel knew exactly who I was. He knew every sacrifice, every deployment, every courtroom, every sleepless night, every burden. And now he was gone. I placed my fork down carefully, the same way I had done hundreds of times in military hearings years ago. "Then I'll see you in court." Vivian smiled. A victorious smile. A cruel smile. "Oh, Margaret." She laughed softly. "You're finished." Nobody spoke after that. Not even Emily. Dinner limped forward for another 20 minutes before finally ending. I drove home alone. Rain had started again. The lake was almost invisible in the darkness. When I entered the house, everything felt quiet. Too quiet. I walked past family photographs, past Daniel's favorite chair, past the bookshelf he built himself. Then I stopped in front of the hallway closet. For a long moment I simply stood there, thinking, remembering. Finally, I opened the door. A small leather case sat on the highest shelf, exactly where I had left it years ago. I carried it into the living room, set it on the coffee table, opened it slowly. Inside rested documents, military records, commendations, commission papers, and one small silver eagle insignia. I picked it up carefully. The metal felt cool against my palm. For years I had avoided looking at it, because I wanted a different life, a quieter life, a normal life. But sitting there in the silence of that house, I realized something important. Vivian Thornton believed she was dragging a helpless widow into court. She believed she was facing an elderly woman who would panic, compromise, disappear. She had absolutely no idea who she had chosen to humiliate. And for the first time since Daniel's death, I remembered exactly who I was. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. I woke before sunrise without needing an alarm. Some habits never disappear. It didn't matter how many years had passed since retirement. The body remembers pressure. The mind remembers responsibility. And somewhere deep inside, the person you used to be waits quietly for moments like this. I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee warming my hands. Outside, the lake was hidden beneath a blanket of fog. The dock Daniel rebuilt years ago was barely visible through the mist. For several minutes, I simply watched the water. Not because I was nervous, because I was remembering. Daniel used to sit across from me at this table every morning. Coffee, newspaper, silence, comfortable silence. The kind built over decades. I missed him most during ordinary moments. Not holidays. Not anniversaries. Mornings. Mornings were the hardest. My eyes drifted toward the leather folder resting beside the coffee mug. Simple. Organized. Thin. Everything I needed was inside. Nothing I didn't. Military courtrooms taught me long ago that people carrying the largest binders were usually compensating for weak arguments. Truth doesn't require decoration, only preparation. At 7:30, I dressed carefully. Gray slacks, navy blouse, dark wool coat. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. I tied my silver hair back neatly and looked at myself in the hallway mirror. What stared back looked exactly like what Vivian expected. Avido. A grandmother. An aging woman most people wouldn't notice at the grocery store. Perfect. Underestimation is a gift. The courthouse stood downtown overlooking several old government buildings. Cold stone. Tall windows. American flags moving lazily in the wind. The same architecture every American city seems to copy whenever it wants a building to look important. I climbed the courthouse steps slowly. Age teaches respect for knees. Halfway up, I heard someone call my name. Mom. Emily hurried toward me carrying 2 coffees. Her expression looked worried already. How are you feeling? I'm breathing. She rolled her eyes. That's not an answer. I smiled. It's the only answer people our age can guarantee. Despite everything, she laughed. Good. She needed that. We entered the courthouse together. The moment we passed through security, I spotted Vivian. Exactly where I expected. Standing near the main hallway surrounded by attorneys. 3 of them. Expensive suits. Expensive briefcases. Expensive confidence. Thomas stood beside her. Looking smug. Looking comfortable. Looking certain. Vivian noticed me immediately. That familiar smile appeared. The one that always looked rehearsed. Margaret. I nodded politely. Vivian. Her eyes moved around the lobby, searching. Looking for something. Or someone. Then she found it. Or rather, didn't. You're alone? Emily stiffened beside me. I answered calmly. No. Vivian laughed softly. You know what I mean. Of course I did. Where was my attorney? Where was my legal team? Where were the expensive professionals? Where was the cavalry? The answer was simple. I didn't need them. But I wasn't ready to explain that yet. One of Vivian's attorneys studied me briefly. His eyes narrowed. Evaluating. Calculating. Predators always notice isolation. Or what they think is isolation. You should have accepted the settlement. Vivian stepped closer. Her perfume arrived before she did. Sharp. Expensive. Aggressive. Met her gaze evanle. And you should have respected your son's wishes. For just a moment, something dark flashed across her face. Then disappeared. There it is. What? That arrogance. I almost smiled. No, I said quietly. That's grief. The words hit harder than I expected. Vivian's expression tightened immediately. She turned away. Conversation over. But I had seen something. The first crack. Tiny. Almost invisible. Yet real. Fear often enters through cracks. The courtroom itself felt smaller than I remembered. Old wooden benches. American flag near the judge's bench. The faint smell of paper and polished wood. Courtrooms always smell the same. No matter where you are, no matter what decade. Some things never change. I took my seat at the defense table. Alone. Across the room, Vivian's legal team began arranging documents. Stacks of paperwork. Binders. Folders. Notes. Charts. Enough material to invade a small country. Emily sat directly behind me. Nervous. Silent. The spectators began filtering into the gallery. A few local reporters. Several curious observers. People drawn by family disputes. Human beings have always been fascinated by conflict, especially other people's conflict. 9 o'clock arrived. The bailiff announced the judge. Everyone stood. Judge William Harrison entered carrying a thick case file beneath one arm. Late 60s. Sharp eyes. Military posture. Disciplined movements. The moment I saw him, I recognized him. Immediately. Not personally. Professionally. 20 years earlier, we crossed paths during a military tribunal at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Back when my hair was dark. Back when my knees didn't complain every morning. Back when neither of us looked our age. He looked older now. So did I. Judge Harrison scanned the courtroom casually. Then his eyes landed on me. And stopped. A strange silence followed. Small. Subtle. But noticeable. I watched recognition spread across his face. Surprise. Memory. Respect. Across the room, Vivian noticed it too. Her smile faded slightly. The hearing began. Vivian's lead attorney stood first. Confident. Polished. Prepared. He launched immediately into the narrative. The story they wanted the court to believe. Your Honor, this is a tragic, but unfortunately common case involving undue influence exerted upon a vulnerable, terminally ill individual. I almost smiled. Classic. Frame the widow as manipulative. Frame the family as concerned. Frame greed as protection. Simple. Predictable. Effective. The attorney continued for nearly 10 minutes. Carefully chosen language. Strategic emotion. Subtle accusations. At one point, he referred to me as financially dependent. That irritated me slightly. Not enough to react. Just enough to remember. Then came the accusation that truly bothered me. Mrs. Whitmore isolated the deceased during the final stages of illness. Emily shifted angrily behind me. Because we both knew the truth. Daniel wasn't isolated. He was exhausted. There is a difference. Cancer doesn't make people antisocial. It makes them tired. Very tired. Eventually, the attorney finished. He looked pleased with himself. The courtroom seemed prepared for a grieving widow to defend herself emotionally. Instead, I simply organized my papers. Quietly. Methodically. Judge Harrison finally turned toward me. Mrs. Whitmore. Yes, Your Honor. Will you be representing yourself today? Yes, sir. Across the room, Vivian smiled. There it was again. Confidence. Certainty. Victory. The judge studied me for several moments. Longer than necessary. Then something changed. Recognition deepened. His posture straightened slightly. The courtroom became strangely quiet. And then it happened. Judge Harrison gave a small, respectful nod. Good morning, Colonel. Silence. Absolute silence. Every sound disappeared instantly. The reporters stopped writing. One attorney lowered his pen. Emily whispered something behind me. I think it was... What? Vivian stared. Completely frozen. The judge continued calmly. It's been a long time. I nodded once. Yes, sir. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody seemed capable of speaking. Vivian looked like someone had physically struck her. Colonel? The word escaped her mouth almost involuntarily. Judge Harrison glanced toward her. Margaret Whitmore served 21 years in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. The silence deepened. One of the younger attorneys swallowed visibly. The older attorney suddenly looked much less comfortable. Because military legal circles are small, very small, especially at senior levels. Vivian stared at me. Confusion. Who? Shock. Disbelief. All competing at once. You were a lawyer? I turned toward her slowly. Yes. No. Her voice cracked. You said you worked for the government. I did. The judge cleared his throat. Mrs. Thornton. Vivian immediately stopped talking. But the damage was done. For the first time since Daniel died, she no longer looked certain. And that was only the beginning. Nobody in the courtroom moved. For several long seconds, the only sound came from the air conditioning system humming softly above our heads. Judge Harrison had just called me Colonel, and suddenly the entire narrative Vivian spent months building began to crack. Not collapse. Not yet. But crack. Across the room, her lead attorney recovered first. Experienced lawyers survive by adapting. Good ones do it quickly. Your Honor, he said carefully, While Mrs. Whitmore's military service is certainly commendable, her previous employment has no direct bearing on ownership of the disputed property. That was technically true. Rank means nothing in civil court. Titles don't determine evidence. But credibility matters everywhere, especially when one side is accusing the other of manipulation. Judge Harrison nodded slightly. Proceed. The attorney continued, though his confidence had changed. Earlier, he sounded like a man delivering a prepared victory speech. Now he sounded like someone walking carefully across thin ice. Interesting. Very interesting. I remained seated quietly, listening, taking notes, observing. Old habits. The attorney resumed his accusations regarding undue influence, isolation, émotionnelle manipulation, financial dependency. The same arguments, the same assumptions, the same story. Eventually he finished. Judge Harrison turned toward me. Colonel Whitmore. A few heads turned again when he used the title. Old respect dies hard. Would you like to respond? Yes, Your Honor. I stood slowly. My knees complained. Age always sends reminders. Even in court. I approached the lectern carrying only a thin folder. One folder. That was all. Across the room, Vivian's legal team had enough paperwork to build a small wall. I almost smiled. Some things never change. The people trying hardest to appear powerful usually carry the most paper. I opened my folder, then looked directly at the attorney. Counsel stated I isolated my husband during treatment. Correct. I nodded. Did you interview Dr. Marcus Levin? The attorney blinked. No. Did you interview his oncology team? No. Did you review hospice visitation recommendations? No. The courtroom became quieter. I continued. Did you review hospital fatigue management records? No. Did you interview a single nurse who treated my husband during the final year of his illness? No. I closed my folder. Thank you. Then I returned to my seat. That was all. No dramatic speech. No emotional outburst. No courtroom theatrics. Just 4 questions. Simple question. Military prosecution taught me something decades ago. People rarely destroy themselves with answers. They destroy themselves with the absence of them. The attorney shifted uncomfortably. The first crack widened. Judge Harrison made a note. Then another. Then another. Good. Across the room, Vivian looked confused. She still expected drama. She still expected emotion. She didn't understand that military attorneys survive on precision, not volume. The hearing continued. Additional evidence was introduced. Financial statements, medical records, family declarations. Every document trying to paint the same picture. A lonely widow manipulating a dying man. I listened patiently. Then I opened my folder again. The older attorney noticed immediately. His eyes narrowed. For the first time that morning, he looked worried. Not nervous. Worried. There is a difference. Your Honor, I stood again. I would like to submit Exhibit D. The bailiff collected copies. Judge Harrison reviewed the first page, then the second, then the third. Something changed in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. The look of a man realizing a case is heading somewhere unexpected. Interesting. Very interesting. Vivian shifted in her chair. What is it? Nobody answered. The older attorney requested a copy. He read the document quickly, then slower. Then again, the younger attorney beside him visibly paled. That got Vivian's attention. What is it? Still, nobody answered. Finally, the attorney cleared his throat. Where exactly did you obtain this? I looked directly at him. From my husband. The courtroom waited. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses. The document itself was simple. Only 3 pages. Notarized. Signed. Witnessed. Created 9 months before Daniel's death. Nothing complicated, nothing dramatic. Just clear. Very clear. The judge read aloud. I, Daniel Whitmore, being of sound mind and acting voluntarily, reaffirm my intent that ownership of the Smith Mountain Lake property remains solely with my wife, Margaret Whitmore. Silence. Pure silence. The judge continued. No person, family member, advisor, or third party has influenced this decision. The courtroom grew still. I make this statement freely and without coercion. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed loudly. Across the room, Vivian looked stunned. Actually stunned. For the first time all morning. That's impossible. The words escaped before she could stop them. I looked at her calmly. No, I said quietly. It's documented. That landed harder than any insult could have. Because facts don't argue. Facts don't shout. Facts simply exist. The attorney requested a recess almost immediately. Judge Harrison granted 10 minutes. The moment the gavel sounded, Vivian turned toward me. Furious. You hid this. Interesting choice of words. I remained seated. You never asked. Her face darkened. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Good. Truth tends to create discomfort. Especially when people spend months avoiding it. The attorney pulled Vivian aside. Their conversation began quietly, then gradually became more intense. I couldn't hear every word. But I heard enough. You told us. You said, why wasn't this disclosed? The older attorney looked genuinely angry now. Not at me. At his client. Because good lawyers hate surprises. And Vivian clearly hadn't told them everything. Military court taught me another lesson years ago. Cases rarely collapse all at once. They unravel, thread by thread, usually because someone becomes overconfident, usually because someone believes their own story, usually because someone mistakes certainty for truth. Vivian had done all three. Emily approached carefully during recess. Her eyes looked completely different now. Not confused. Not frightened. Amazed. Mom! I looked up. You really were a colonel. I smiled faintly. Retired colonel. She sat beside me. Still staring. You prosecuted military cases? Yes. For how long? 21 years. Her eyes widened again. Why didn't you tell me? That question hurt a little. Not because she asked it. Because I knew why. I reached over and squeezed her hand gently. Because I wanted to be your mother. Her eyes softened immediately. Not colonel. Not prosecutor. Not officer. Just mom. That was the life I chose after retirement. That was the life Daniel helped me build. And I never regretted it. Not once. The bailiff announced court would resume shortly. People returned to their seats. Vivian looked noticeably different now. More cautious. Les certains. Fear had entered the room. Not panic. Fear. And fear changes everything. Judge Harrison resumed proceedings. The older attorney stood again. But his confidence was gone. Now he looked careful. Measured. Defensive. Exactly where I wanted him. The judge reviewed several documents before looking toward me. Colonel Whitmore. Yes, Your Honor. Do you possess additional supporting evidence relevant to this dispute? I paused deliberately. Just long enough? Then opened my folder once more. Yes. The single word echoed through the room. Vivian's face lost what little color remained. Because suddenly she realized something. Something terrifying. I hadn't come to court unprepared. I had come patient. And there is nothing more dangerous in a courtroom than a patient prosecutor holding evidence nobody else has seen. Slowly, I removed a second bundle of documents from the folder. A bundle much thicker than the first. The older attorney's eyes widened. Vivian stared at the stack. Then at me. Then back at the stack. For the first time since Daniel's death, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. And she hadn't even seen the contents yet. The courtroom felt different now. Not louder. Not more dramatic. Heavier. Truth has weight. And once enough of it enters a room, people start carrying themselves differently. The reporters in the back row leaned forward. The attorneys sat straighter. Even the spectators seemed more attentive. Everybody sensed the same thing. The case had shifted. Permanently. I stood calmly beside the evidence table holding the second stack of documents. Across the room, Vivian Thornton watched me with growing unease. For months, she had treated this lawsuit like a formality. A rich family correcting an inconvenience. Now she looked like someone realizing she had walked into a storm wearing paper armor. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses. You may proceed, Colonel. Thank you, Your Honor. I handed copies to the bailiff. The documents were distributed. The older attorney read the first page. Then the second. His expression tightened immediately. The younger attorney looked even worse. He actually stopped taking notes. Always a bad sign. What is it? Vivian whispered. Neither lawyer answered. That told her everything she needed to know. I opened another section of my folder. Your Honor, Exhibit F consists of correspondence between the deceased and various family members during the final year of his illness. Judge Harrison nodded. I continued. Specifically, communications regarding repeated attempts to alter estate arrangements. The courtroom became very quiet. The older attorney cleared his throat. Objection regarding context. Overruled. Judge Harrison didn't even hesitate. The attorney sat back down. Not happily, but wisely. I opened the first document. An email. Simple. Direct. Painfully honest. Judge Harrison read silently for nearly 30 seconds. Then he looked toward Vivian. Mrs. Thornton. She sat up immediately. Yes? Did you repeatedly contact your son regarding ownership of the lake property during active chemotherapy treatment? Her face hardened. No. The answer came too quickly. Much too quickly. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. After 21 years in military prosecution, I recognized rehearsed answers immediately. The judge glanced toward me. I nodded. Page 4. Your Honor. He turned the page. Read for several seconds. Then removed his glasses. The courtroom remained silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, the judge read aloud. Mom, if you bring up the lake house again, I will ask hospital staff to limit visitation. The words echoed through the room. Slowly. Painfully. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Judge Harrison continued. Maggie spends every day helping me survive treatment while you continue talking about property. Silence. Absolute silence. Emily covered her mouth. Across the room, Thomas lowered his eyes. Vivian sat frozen. The judge continued reading. I need peace right now. Nobody spoke. Not one person. The older attorney closed his eyes briefly, because he understood exactly how damaging this was. Not legally. Humanly. The courtroom was no longer seeing a concerned mother protecting family assets. Now they were seeing a dying man begging for peace. Big difference. A very big difference. I remained standing. Calm. Controlled. Professional. Inside, however, I felt something entirely different. Sadness. Because Daniel never wanted any of this. Not 1 second of it. The final year of his life had already been difficult enough. Cancer had stolen pieces of him little by little. Strength. Energy. Sleep. Appetite. Privacy. And apparently even then he still had to defend me. The realization hurt more than I expected. Judge Harrison placed the email down carefully. Mrs. Thornton, would you like to explain this correspondence? Vivian swallowed. For the first time all day, she looked uncertain. I was worried. The judge waited. About family property. That answer landed badly. Very badly. Several people exchanged glances. The older attorney looked miserable, because deep down he already knew. The case was dying. I opened another document. Your Honor, Exhibit G. The courtroom became still again. The judge accepted the next file. This one contained text messages. Months' worth. Organized chronologically. Carefully preserved. The older attorney's shoulders visibly slumped. The younger attorney looked like he wanted to disappear. Vivian simply stared. Page after page documented the same pattern. Pressure. Manipulation. Persistence. Demand after demand. Conversation after conversation. Property. 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 Always property. Finally, Judge Harrison stopped reading. The disappointment on his face was obvious. Mrs. Thornton. His voice had changed. Less neutral. More disappointed. Did you continue contacting your son regarding inheritance matters after being asked repeatedly to stop? Vivian didn't answer immediately. That silence answered more than words could. The judge made another note. Then another. Then another. The room understood. And so did Vivian. But the worst part was still coming. I opened the final section of my folder. The thickest section. The section I hoped I would never need. The older attorney saw it immediately. His face lost color. What is that? I looked at him. Protection. Nobody understood. Not yet. Judge Harrison looked toward me. Colonel Nell? I took a slow breath. Then answered. Audio recordings. The courtroom froze. Completely. Vivian's eyes widened. For a moment she looked genuinely frightened. And suddenly she remembered. The phone calls. Months of phone calls. The judge sat forward. Audio recordings? Yes, Your Honor. Relevant to the case? Very. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Nobody even reached for a pen. The older attorney whispered something to Vivian. She ignored him. Still staring at me. Still trying to understand. I continued. During Daniel's treatment, repeated accusations were made against me. The room listened. He became concerned. I paused and asked me to preserve certain conversations. The silence became unbearable. The judge nodded slowly. Proceed. The bailiff connected the audio device. A small speaker sat on the evidence table. Ordinary. Harmless. Yet somehow more dangerous than anything else in the room. I pressed play. Vivian's voice immediately filled the courtroom. Cold. Sharp. Unmistakable. If Margaret really cared about you, she'd put the property back into the Thornton family before you're gone. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The recording continued. You're sick, Daniel. You aren't thinking clearly. The room became painfully still. Then came Daniel's voice. Weak. Exhausted. Fragile. A voice I hadn't heard in months. The sound hit me harder than I expected. For a moment I forgot where I was. Forgot the courtroom. Forgot the lawsuit. Forgot everything. Because suddenly Daniel was alive again. Speaking. Breathing. Trying. The recording continued. Mom? His voice sounded tired. So very tired. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Please stop. Silence. The entire courtroom stopped breathing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even looked away. Because everybody heard it. The exhaustion. The pain. The desperation. Not a wealthy man discussing property. A dying son begging his mother for peace. Judge Harrison reached forward slowly. And stopped the recording. Nobody said a word. Not immediately. The silence stretched. Long. Heavy. Real. Finally, the judge removed his glasses. His expression was no longer neutral. It hadn't been for a while. Mrs. Thornton. His voice was calm. Dangerously calm. This court now has significant concerns. Vivian looked down. For the first time all day. Not angry. Not defensive. Defeated. The older attorney closed his folder. That alone told me everything. The case was over. It just hadn't been officially buried yet. Judge Harrison continued. If additional evidence supports a pattern of coercive conduct involving a medically vulnerable individual, he paused. The room listened. Criminal exposure may become a relevant consideration. The sentence landed like a hammer. Several reporters immediately started writing. Thomas looked physically ill. The younger attorney stared at the floor. And Vivian. Vivian looked old. Not wealthy. Not powerful. Not influential. Just old. An aging woman watching years of control collapse in public. The judge reviewed several final pages. Then looked toward both legal tables. His voice remained measured. Professional. Final. This court will recess briefly before issuing findings. The gavel struck. People began moving again. Slowly. Cautiously. Like survivors emerging after a storm. I returned to my seat. Emily grabbed my hand immediately. Tears filled her eyes. Mom! I squeezed her hand gently. Neither of us spoke. Across the room, Vivian sat completely still. Her attorneys surrounded her, talking urgently, explaining options, discussing damage control. It didn't matter anymore. The truth had already entered the room. And truth rarely leaves quietly. Then, for the first time all day, Vivian looked directly at me. There was no arrogance left, no superiority, no confidence. Only fear, because she finally understood something. The verdict hadn't been announced yet, but she already knew she had lost. And Judge Harrison was about to make it official. By the time Judge Harrison returned to the bench, nobody in the courtroom was pretending anymore. Not the attorneys. Not the reporters. Not the spectators. And certainly not Vivian Thornton. The confidence she carried into that courthouse 4 days earlier had vanished completely. She sat quietly beside her legal team, staring at the table in front of her. Not speaking. Not moving. Not arguing. For the first time since Daniel died, silence had finally reached her. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood, then sat. Judge Harrison opened the case file one final time. The courtroom became still. I glanced briefly toward Emily. She looked exhausted. So did I. People imagine courtroom victories feel exciting. Most don't. Especially later in life. At 63, I had learned that winning usually feels less like celebration and more like relief. The judge reviewed several pages before speaking. His voice was calm, measured, final. This court has carefully reviewed the evidence presented. Nobody moved. The room listened. The testimony, documentary evidence, correspondence, medical records, and audio recordings overwhelmingly support the validity of the deceased's estate intentions. Across the room, Vivian lowered her eyes. Judge Harrison continued. The court finds no credible evidence supporting allegations of undue influence by Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. A long silence followed. Not because people were surprised, because hearing truth spoken officially carries its own weight. The petition challenging ownership of the Smith Mountain Lake property is denied in its entirety. Emily burst into tears behind me. Soft tears. Relieved tears. I closed my eyes briefly. Not because of the property. Because of Daniel. Because after months of accusations, assumptions, and humiliation, someone had finally defended his voice. The judge wasn't finished. He turned another page. This court further finds substantial evidence suggesting repeated attempts to pressure the deceased during periods of significant medical vulnerability. The room became even quieter. Vivian looked physically ill now. Judge Harrison's voice sharpened slightly. Such conduct is deeply troubling. Nobody moved. If additional circumstances had been present, this matter could have warranted criminal review. The older attorney closed his eyes. The younger attorney stared at the table. Thomas looked like he wanted to disappear, and Vivian simply sat there, silent. The gavel struck. Case dismissed. Just like that. It was over. Months of stress. Months of grief. Months of fighting. Finished. The courtroom slowly came back to life. People gathered papers. Reporters hurried toward the hallway. Attorneys began quiet conversations. Emily wrapped both arms around me before I even stood. We did it. I smiled softly. No. She looked confused. I glanced toward the judge's bench, then toward the folder containing Daniel's letters. Your father did. That made her cry harder. A few minutes later, we stepped outside onto the courthouse plaza. The sky was cloudy. A cold wind moved through downtown Norfolk. Reporters immediately approached. Question. Microphones. Requests for statements. I declined every one of them. I had spent too much of my life in courtrooms to confuse justice with publicity. The truth didn't need a press conference. Across the plaza, Vivian stood alone near the curb. Her attorneys were leaving. Thomas had already disappeared. Nobody stood beside her. Nobody comforted her. Nobody defended her. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely isolated. I watched her for several seconds. Then surprised myself. I walked toward her. Emily started to follow. I gently shook my head. She stayed where she was. Vivian looked startled when I stopped beside her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind moved lightly through the trees lining the courthouse grounds. Cars passed in the distance. Life continued, as it always does. Finally, she looked at me. You could report me. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I considered the question. Yes. You'd probably win. Probably. She stared at the sidewalk, then asked something I never expected. Why are you showing me mercy? I looked up at the gray Virginia sky. For a long moment I said nothing, because some answers deserve careful handling. Finally, I looked back at her. After 21 years prosecuting people, my voice remained calm. I learned something. Vivian waited. Punishment changes behavior. I paused. Mercy reveals character. Her eyes filled with tears immediately. Real tears. Not courtroom tears. Not manipulative tears. Human tears. The kind that arrive after pride finally leaves. I nodded once, then turned and walked away. 3 months later, the lake house felt different. Not empty. Healed. There is a difference. Empty feels abandoned. Healed feels peaceful. October arrived quietly that year. One cool morning I stood on the dock holding a cup of coffee while fog drifted across the lake. The water moved gently beneath the morning light. The same dock. The same lake. The same view Daniel loved. Yet somehow everything felt lighter. The legal battle was over. The accusations were over. The noise was over. Only the memories remained. And those were welcome. Emily visited nearly every weekend now. So did my grandchildren. The trial had changed something between us. For years they saw me as Mom. Grandma. The quiet woman who baked pies and tended flowers. Now they understood there had been other chapters before that. One Saturday afternoon, my grandson Luke discovered an old military photograph while helping clean the storage room. Grandma. I looked up. He held the picture carefully. Is this really you? I laughed softly. The photograph showed me standing beside a courtroom podium in Germany nearly 30 years earlier. Dark hair, dress uniform, sharp posture. A completely different season of life. Yes. His eyes widened. You look scary. I laughed harder. A genuine laugh. The first one, in a very long time. Sometimes that helped. Luke studied the picture again. Mom says you were a colonel. I was. Was it cool? Children ask wonderful questions. Simple question. Honest questions. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. No. He looked surprised. No? It was useful. Luke considered that seriously, then nodded. Apparently satisfied. Useful. Not important. Not powerful. Useful. At 63, that felt like the better word. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Vivian called. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But age teaches another lesson. Bitterness weighs more than conversation. Eventually I picked up. Her voice sounded fragile. Not dramatic. Not manipulative. Just tired. Margaret? Yes? There was a long pause. Then she asked quietly, could we talk? We met at a small diner halfway between Norfolk and the lake. The kind of place older Americans know well. Brown coffee mugs. Pancake specials. Waitresses who call everyone honey. Vivian arrived wearing a simple gray coat. No pearls. No designer handbag. No performance. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked ordinary. And somehow that made her seem more human. We sat across from each other while rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally she spoke. I was angry. I said nothing. Daniel. That surprised me. He chose you. Her voice cracked slightly. Every time. There it was. The truth. Not greed. Not money. Fear. Fear disguised as control. Fear disguised as entitlement. Fear disguised as family loyalty. Older parents sometimes struggle when children build lives beyond them. Some handle it gracefully. Some don't. Vivian wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. When he got sick, she stopped, trying to steady herself. I panicked. For the first time, I saw the grieving mother beneath the arrogance. Not excusing what she did. Understanding it. There is a difference. Understanding doesn't erase damage, but it can soften hatred. I loved him too, I said quietly. Vivian nodded immediately. Tears filled her eyes. I know, that sentence carried more weight than the entire trial. Winter arrived slowly that year. Christmas came. The grandchildren filled the lake house with noise. Laughter returned. Life returned. Not the same life. A new one. One Christmas Eve, Luke sat beside the fireplace holding that same military photograph. Grandma? Yes? Were you really important? I smiled. Children ask dangerous questions because they expect honest answers. I thought carefully, then answered. I was useful. Luke nodded immediately, as though it made perfect sense. Maybe it did. Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I stepped onto the porch alone. The lake reflected moonlight in long silver streaks. Cold air filled my lungs. And for the first time since Daniel died, silence didn't hurt. It comforted. I realized then that the trial had never truly been about property. It wasn't even about justice. Not entirely. It was about protecting love from being rewritten by bitterness. About protecting memory from being distorted by greed. About preserving dignity when someone tries to take it away. People often underestimate quiet individuals, They mistake kindness for weakness, patience for helplessness, grace for surrender. But dignity has a remarkable habit of revealing itself eventually, usually when it matters most, and often when nobody expects it. The lake remained calm beneath the moonlight. I smiled, then looked toward the house where my family slept peacefully. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt at peace too.